Oh, hi there. Welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. This is my review of the 2025 movie Wasteman. So I'll avoid giving away spoilers in this review, but I will be talking about character development and some of the main themes of the movie. So if you haven't seen it yet, then I'd recommend to go away and watch it perhaps and then come back here after. So Wasteman, it's a tightly told 90-minute, unflinching and extremely gritty portrayal of life in a British prison. And it's written by Hunter Andrews and Owen Doran, and it's directed by Cal McMau, and this is his first feature film. And it stars David Jonsson as Taylor and Tom Blyth as Dee, the two main characters. And it's then got an ensemble cast of fellow prisoners. And the film's had absolutely loads of critical acclaim, and it was nominated for Outstanding Debut by a British writer, director or producer at the BAFTAs. And then Cal McMau, he picked up the Best Debut Director at the British Independent Film Awards. And then it's also garnered other nominations at those awards and others. So it's doing really well, and not without reason. So the setup here is that Taylor, played by David Jonsson, is a long-time prisoner, but is put up for early release, whilst at the same time then being paired with a new cellmate, Dee, for his last few weeks in prison. And what follows is a coming together of two rival prison gangs, with a sort of tit-for-tat escalation of violence between those gangs within the prison walls, with Taylor then being caught up in the middle of it. And all he wants to do is get home to see his son again. And so the drama unfolds as Taylor, desperately tries to stay alive and to stay out of trouble. So at the outset, I'm going to say I really enjoyed this film. And it's kind of hard to explain really, but from the very opening scene, this film is all over you like a rash, and there's just no let up at all. It's extremely gritty and it's in your face throughout. And the film opens with footage being filmed through a mobile phone camera. So immediately you're in this sort of claustrophobic and oppressive world where you're looking at the drama unfold through this tiny, narrow framing. And then the bulk of the film is actually filmed in a 3:2 aspect ratio. And so that, coupled with the footage from the mobile phone video shots throughout the movie, give it that claustrophobic and oppressive feel that I was talking about. And then the other thing to note is that there's not a single shot in this movie of anything or anywhere outside the prison walls. And so the upshot of all that is that you're absolutely immersed in this life. You are trapped with these guys in this prison. And then the other thing to mention about the style and content is just the unvarnished sort of gritty violence which you're right up close to. And most people these days are going to have some concept of prisons as just extremely violent and aggressive places, but here there's also a looming sense of dread that things are just going to escalate at a moment's notice. And partly that's down to the excellent acting and the character development, as Dee in particular is just so volatile. But then when the violence does erupt, there's blood splatter, saliva on the camera screen, there's sustained and sort of hyper realistic violence, and most importantly there's just no escape. So when we do see violence depicted on screen, generally within a 2 metre by 6 metre cell. So you're present, you're up close, and you can almost feel the blows as they land on some poor bastard's head. And of course we see our old prison favourite, the pool ball in a sock. Can't watch a prison drama without that happening. And so as I was watching it, the violence sort of called to mind maybe older films like Scum or Romper Stomper, or if people also watch the American prison drama Oz. And so you get that sort of hyper aggressive content, which is then coupled with that looming sense of threat and jeopardy as the film progresses. And it's that combination which just makes it extremely effective and just so gritty in my opinion. And then we've really got great performances here. And so as I touched on, Taylor is played here by David Jonsson, and he plays a sort of physically small, quite vulnerable drug addict. And we don't get too much by way of backstory, but we know he has a 14-year-old son on the outside, and he's been in prison for a very long time due to a drugs conviction. And after watching the film, I saw an interview with David Jonsson in which he said he'd lost a load of weight for this movie. And he really plays that sort of hopeless, put-upon drug addict really well. And his physical stature then feeds into that excellent performance. And of course, Jonsson's career is really going great guns at the moment. I've seen him recently in Industry, where he plays a city banker, and then more recently in the Alien Romulus movie, where he played a synthetic human or an android. So he's certainly far from being typecast, and so good for him. As I mentioned, he's absolutely great here. And then Dee, on the other hand, played by Tom Blyth, he's all about bravado and swagger. So from his very first scene, we know exactly what he's all about as he sets up shop in Taylor's cell, literally. And there's sort of this kind of youthful arrogance and swagger to him. Again, we don't get much of his backstory, but we can deduce that he's probably been on the road, maybe he's well connected outside, and therefore that he holds some sort of sway and influence within the prison walls. That, and of course the numerous drone deliveries that he gets from over the prison walls. And so it's a whirlwind of a performance really from Blyth here. And we see Dee's anger, his violence, his physical strength, the partying, but especially his need for control and influence come to the fore. And then juxtaposed against Taylor's weak physical demeanour, Dee, comes across as really a strong, forceful character, both in the sense of how he looks, but then also his demeanour. And that's a great combination between those two, and it really powers the movie forwards and helps it hang together. And then what else? Well, I would say this is not really a political film in many senses of the word, but one of the things I think it captures really effectively is the huge impact of austerity and budget cuts on the prison system. So through this film, we're essentially watching these prisoners live in a failed system. I mentioned it earlier, but Taylor's being let out on an early release scheme, and that's because they simply haven't got the prison space available for non-violent offenders. And then throughout the film, we see the lack of prison staff. There's one scene in particular in which the prisoners are locked down because they simply haven't got the staff to allow them out of their cells. And then we also see the non-existent response to both drugs and violence. So we're essentially watching the law of the jungle here. We're watching a lawless place run itself along the lines of crime and just brute strength. And if we think about what the purpose of prison once was, yes, to punish people, but then also perhaps to rehabilitate them and help them when they then get let out, well, we can be certain that nobody is being rehabilitated in this environment at all. And at its heart, I thought there was a sort of nihilism, a sort of futility and maybe hopelessness on show here. And that's perfectly captured by the endemic drug use and the violence that we see throughout the film. And then in a similar vein, we also see that the boundaries of prison life and outside life are diffuse due to the presence of mobile phones and drones. So we touched on Dee being well connected and perhaps being part of some gang or criminal group outside the prison walls. And what we see across this film is that those boundaries are porous and they exacerbate the violence and the drug use that I just talked about. And of course that is most obvious with the drone deliveries and the use of mobile phones. But it's also quite clear with the threats that can be made towards someone's loved ones, for example. The movie emphasises that there's literally no escape because things that happen on the inside can easily lead to retribution or consequences for people on the outside. And then finally, also loved the fact that despite all the brutality, the violence and the hopelessness, it also captures, albeit fleetingly, a sense of camaraderie and togetherness between the prisoners. So we have scenes where they are partying together or where they might share information about their families, and it's quite tender in some places. And likewise, there's also snippets of hope across the piece. So most often we see that hope manifested here through Taylor as he's, trying to make plans for a relationship with his son, or as he's trying to make plans for life on the outside. But of course, this is not some romantic movie with a happy ending. What we see is that those moments of camaraderie and hope can easily be snuffed out in a moment if it's expedient for someone to do so. So in summary, this is a really in-your-face, violent world which shines a light on the failings of the British state more generally, but specifically on our sort of punishment culture in this country and our failure to resource these essential public services. The performances are absolutely superb and the filmmaking is likewise. Cal McMau, the director here, deserves all the plaudits for this. And as I said, I really enjoyed it and I found it extremely powerful and thought-provoking. So yeah, I'd highly recommend for people to go out and watch this one if they can. And of course, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.